So we're going to start with French knots, and you'll find French knots in a number of the Needlepoint To Go canvases. It's a very versatile stitch. It's used for a lot of different reasons, but in this particular case, it's used as the 4 little points that anchor the sunshade into the sand. They're little round knots that just sit up off the canvas and just give a lovely little added detail. So we're going to start today with a waist knot, and waist knot is simply, I've tied a knot in the end of the thread. Reason being, I need somewhere to anchor my thread because I'm starting with a blank canvas. So the first French knot that I'm going to show you is coming up through the hole of the canvas, wrapping the thread one time around the needle, sinking the needle back down in through the same hole I came up in. By putting my finger on the very tip of the French knot, it helps to maintain the tightness of the knot. The reason I hold it in place is to create consistency so that all the knots will look the same. So when I do the second one, coming up through the hole, going back down through the same hole, holding that knot in place, you'll see that the knots are quite consistent. If I don't hold it in place, I will wrap my needle, go down, let go, and I have what's referred to as a very messy French knot, which also has its place and is often used in beards and hair and that kind of thing to give variety. Another way of doing a French knot is to come up through the hole of the lower left and treat this area like an intersection. We're going to then wrap the needle just as we did with the first one, but instead of going down through the same hole, we're going to go down through the hole in the upper left, the way you would create a tent stitch. What this does is it allows the stitch to sit up on the canvas that gives a little bit more definition. Either one is right, and both work incredibly well. They work well for shrubbery, beards, buttons, centers of flowers. It's a very, very versatile stitch that you will find you will use over and over again. Now, in the case of doing multiple French knots, you're going to find that it looks quite dense. And that's the coverage that you may or may not want. If you want increased coverage, then feel free to bring your needle up, and instead of wrapping your thread once, wrap it twice. And obviously that's going to make a larger French knot. That will cover areas a little bit more cleanly than the single ones, but it really becomes personal choice. So wrap it twice, you're going to get a bigger French knot. So as you can see from our French knots here, it gives you quite a good coverage, quite dense. And if that's the look you're going for, terrific. But in some cases, like this Santa, where you have a beard, you'll notice that there's a fair number of them that are required. So instead of doing it completely in French knots, we're going to do what's referred to as alternating tent and French knots. Most times when we do this, we'll do it with 2 different threads, and that's how I'm going to demonstrate it to you today. So basically what we start with, again, I'm going to start with a waist knot just so that I have somewhere to anchor my canvas, my thread, sorry. And as you can see on the canvas, you can see the vertical line versus the horizontal line of the canvas. What I mean by that is the vertical thread is crossing over the horizontal thread. That particular weave is exactly what we're going to put our alternating French knots on. So every time you see the canvas going over, the vertical canvas going over the horizontal canvas thread, that's going to be our tent stitch. So I'm going to drop down 1 to 2, and I'm going to create a pattern that is also referred to as skip tent, which I believe you will also find very often used in backgrounds. It gives a lighter coverage. It allows the paint from the back to show through. So this is the beginning of this composite stitch. So what I'm doing is I'm simply doing a skip tent, covering the canvas on every other stitch. Now for the stitches that I haven't covered, that's where we'll use our French knots. And the beauty of using two different threads, especially if you use a sparkle, is that it just gives a little bit of a highlight to the beard or the hair or whatever you happen to be using the stitch for. So we'll just come back up, and I will then start with Whisper. Whisper is a great thread used very often for hair and beard and mustaches and all sorts of fun things because it's got a fuzziness to it. And it really does mimic hair. I'm going to come up on the horizontal. So you'll see where the horizontal row of the canvas is crossing the vertical. And that's where all these French knots will go. And that's why we refer to it as alternating French knots. Now the trick here is going to be to simply move that thread to the side, and that's the beauty of working on stretcher bars. You can just wrap your thread out of the way so it doesn't cause any problems. So I'm just going to tie a waist knot in this, and I'm going to do this when you stitch this way, you will be crossing the intersection, just as you did in the last one. So we'll come up in the lower left. I'm going to wrap the thread one time and then sink it in the upper right hole. And I'm going to continue doing that, coming up through the lower left, wrapping it once, sinking it in the upper right. And you'll see that it's a lighter coverage, but creates interest as well. So it's not as dense, but it works incredibly well for hair and beards. I use it a lot in a lot of different applications. Again, a very easy stitch, and it's just going to give your canvas a little bit more definition. The last variation of a French knot I'm going to show you is French knots on a stick. And French knots on a stick can be found in this little gnome with his beard. And what we're doing is we're just allowing the thread to come down and then anchoring it with a French knot. In this case, varying the lengths of the actual stitch. So to do that, again, it's really easy and straightforward. We're going to anchor the thread just like we did before. Come up. And in this case, I'm going to go from the top down. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to run the length, and I'm going to take my French knot down to here. So I'm going to pull the thread down, wrap it around the needle, and directly in the same row, sink my needle down, holding the knot in place. And again, you can wrap it once, you can wrap it twice, very much your choice depending on the coverage you want. This time I might make it a little bit shorter because I understand that not all beards grow the same length. And again, you're holding that knot in place to create the consistency that you're looking for in the knot. I can double it, and you'll see that I'm going to get a chubbier French knot. But just easy to do. And you're basically following the design as it's painted on the canvas. So when you look at your gnomes, in this case, this fellow, you'll see that they're at different lengths, and you're just simply following the way the canvas has been painted. Very straightforward, a stitch I know you're going to enjoy adding to your stitch inventory.